"Save this patient, and I will resign." The CEO humiliated the nurse, but what she did next surprised everyone. The CEO stood over the dying patient and made a bet no one expected. "Save him," he said with that cruel smirk, "and I'll resign." The room went silent. The 30-year-old man was seizing violently, alarms screaming, his body fighting for every breath. Every doctor had given up, but Carolyn Combs, a nurse they'd all underestimated, stepped forward with nothing but a bottle of water and steady hands. What she did next didn't just save a life. It exposed a secret that had been buried for years. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The alarms were screaming. That piercing, relentless sound that turns every head in a hospital hallway and makes experienced nurses move faster. In room 347 of Metropolitan General Hospital, a 30-year-old man was fighting for his life, his body convulsing violently against the thin hospital sheets. His jaw locked tight, muscles rigid, then releasing in waves of tremors that made the bed frame rattle. The oxygen monitor flashed red. His lips were pale, almost blue, and his breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps between the seizures. Around his bed stood a small crowd frozen in uncertainty. Dr. Bruce Anderson gripped his stethoscope, his face tight with the kind of helplessness that good doctors hate. A security officer shifted his weight near the door, uncomfortable witness to something he didn't fully understand. Two other nurses stood back, their eyes darting between the patient and the man who dominated the room, not with medical expertise, but with something far more dangerous: authority. The CEO of Metropolitan General Hospital stood at the foot of the bed with his arms folded across his chest, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He had perfected that expression over 8 years of running this hospital. A look that said he was always the smartest person in the room, always in control, always untouchable. Tonight was supposed to be another performance, another opportunity to remind everyone who held the power here. His eyes settled on Carolyn Combs, the nurse who had drawn his attention for 3 weeks now. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she hadn't cowered. She stood at the patient's side, her hands steady, her face calm despite the chaos erupting around her. Every other medical professional in the room had tried something and failed. The seizures kept coming. The patient was slipping away. And that's when the CEO spoke, his voice cutting through the alarm's wail with casual cruelty. "If you save him," he said, never breaking eye contact with Carolyn, "I'll resign." The room went silent except for the machines. Even the alarms seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Everyone understood what had just happened. This wasn't about the patient anymore. This was about humiliation, about breaking someone's spirit in front of witnesses, about reminding a competent nurse that her skill meant nothing against his power. Dr. Anderson's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The security officer's hand tightened on his radio. The other nurses looked at the floor. They had all seen this before, in different forms, with different victims. They knew how this was supposed to end. But Carolyn Combs didn't look at the CEO. She looked at the man on the bed, at his chest rising and falling irregularly, at his fingers twitching against the sheets, at the desperate fight for survival happening in his failing body. She reached for something simple. A small bottle of water sitting on the tray beside the bed. And she made a choice. But to understand why this moment mattered, you need to know who Carolyn Combs really was. 3 weeks earlier, Carolyn Combs had walked through the automatic doors of Metropolitan General Hospital, carrying a single cardboard box and 15 years of emergency nursing experience. She was 52 years old, though most people guessed younger. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her scrubs were pressed, and her shoes were the kind that veteran nurses wear, comfortable, sensible, broken in from thousands of 12-hour shifts. She had come from St. Catherine's Medical Center in Philadelphia, where her name carried weight. Trauma certifications, advanced cardiac life support, pediatric emergency specialist. She had trained new doctors, mentored dozens of nurses, and earned commendations for staying calm when everyone else was falling apart. Her former colleagues had thrown her a going-away party that lasted until 2 in the morning, full of stories about the lives she had touched and the crises she had navigated with that signature steady presence. But none of that mattered at Metropolitan General. Here, she was simply the new hire in a hospital that chewed through nursing staff like disposable supplies. She had moved back to her hometown for one reason: her mother. At 78, living alone was becoming difficult, and Carolyn was an only child. The decision had been easy, even if it meant leaving behind a career she had built brick by brick. Family came first. It always had. Her first day had been unremarkable in the way that first days often are. A blur of paperwork, orientation sessions, and introductions to people whose names she would learn eventually. She listened carefully, smiled genuinely, and asked thoughtful questions. When the head nurse showed her the emergency supply closet, Carolyn noticed immediately that the crash cart was missing updated medications. She mentioned it quietly, not as criticism, just as observation. The head nurse had looked at her with something like relief, as if competence was a rare commodity here. By her second shift, Carolyn was already making a difference in small ways. She stayed 20 minutes past her shift to sit with an elderly patient who was frightened and alone. She reorganized the medication dispensary to make critical drugs easier to access during emergencies. She learned the names of the custodial staff and thanked them for their work. These weren't grand gestures. They were simply who she was. Her first encounter with the CEO happened during morning rounds on her 5th day. He swept through the floor with an entourage, barely glancing at the nurses as he critiqued everything from room assignments to supply costs. When he reached Carolyn, he paused, looked at her name badge, and said with a thin smile, "You're the experienced nurse from Philadelphia. Let's hope Metropolitan General lives up to your standards." The words were polite. The tone was not. It was the kind of subtle condescension that more experienced people recognize immediately. A test, a challenge, a warning wrapped in courtesy. Carolyn had simply nodded and returned to her work. She had dealt with difficult administrators before. She knew that proving herself would take time, not confrontation. What Carolyn didn't know was that the CEO had buried something dark in this hospital's history, and she was about to stumble into it. Over the following weeks, Carolyn began to see the pattern. It wasn't obvious at first. Just small moments that felt off, uncomfortable exchanges that lingered in the air after they ended. But as the days accumulated, those moments formed a picture that became impossible to ignore. The CEO conducted rounds every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and they were performances designed to intimidate. He would stop at random nurses' stations and quiz staff on protocols, not to ensure patient safety, but to catch people in mistakes. When a young nurse named Jennifer stammered while explaining a medication schedule, he cut her off mid-sentence. "If you can't handle basic communication," he said loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "perhaps you should consider a different profession." Jennifer's face had flushed crimson, and her hands trembled for the rest of the shift. Equipment failures were mounting. The defibrillator in the West Wing had been malfunctioning for 6 weeks. Nurses had submitted 3 separate maintenance requests. Each one disappeared into administrative silence. When the head nurse mentioned it during a staff meeting, the CEO dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "We're reviewing cost allocations," he said. "Not every piece of equipment needs immediate replacement just because staff feels anxious." The subtext was clear. Your concerns are inconvenient, and raising them makes you a problem. In the break room, during those rare quiet moments between crises, other nurses shared their stories with Carolyn in hushed voices. There was Marcus, a 7-year veteran, who had reported a pattern of medication errors linked to understaffing. His concerns were met with a written warning for creating a hostile work environment. There was Diane, who had questioned why patient-to-nurse ratios kept climbing beyond safe levels. She was reassigned to the night shift the following week. A punishment disguised as scheduling necessity. The message spread through the hospital like a virus. Speak up, and you'll pay for it. This culture of fear had been carefully cultivated over 8 years. The CEO had taken over Metropolitan General when it was struggling financially, and he had turned it profitable through ruthless efficiency. But efficiency, Carolyn was learning, had come at the cost of safety, morale, and basic human dignity. Staff turnover was constant. Good nurses left. Good doctors became quiet. Dr. Bruce Anderson was one of those doctors. Carolyn watched him during a particularly difficult case, a cardiac emergency that required quick decisions and steady hands. He was brilliant, compassionate, exactly the kind of physician patients needed. But when he started to mention concerns about the outdated monitoring equipment to the CEO during rounds, Carolyn saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear. He swallowed his words mid-sentence and redirected to something safer, something that wouldn't mark him as troublesome. After rounds, Carolyn found him in the hallway. "You were going to say something," she said gently. Dr. Anderson looked at her with exhausted eyes. I have student loans, a mortgage, 2 kids in college. I can't afford to be the next person he decides to make an example of. The resignation in his voice was heartbreaking. Not because he was weak, but because the system had made courage too expensive. This was how hope died in places like this. Not dramatically, but in small surrenders, day after day, until people forgot what it felt like to stand up for what was right. But the CEO had made one critical miscalculation. He'd never encountered someone like Carolyn before. If you believe toxic leaders should face consequences, comment and own more bullies. Your voice matters. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night when the ambulance arrived. Carolyn was working the late shift in the emergency department, understaffed as usual, with only 3 nurses covering what should have required 6. The automatic doors burst open, and paramedics rushed in with a gurney carrying a 30-year-old man who was already showing signs of distress. His name was Michael Chun, and according to the paramedics' rapid-fire briefing, he had a documented history of seizure disorders that had been well controlled for years. Until tonight, his girlfriend had called 911 when he collapsed at home during dinner. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was conscious but disoriented, his words slurring, his movements uncoordinated. During the transport, his condition had deteriorated. Now, as they wheeled him into room 347, his eyes were rolling back, his fingers twitching with the early warning signs of something much worse coming. Carolyn moved immediately into assessment mode, checking his vitals, his responsiveness, his airway. His blood pressure was spiking. His temperature was elevated. The neurological symptoms were escalating by the minute. She called for Dr. Anderson, who arrived within 60 seconds, his face already tight with concern as he reviewed the paramedics' notes. What made everything worse was the equipment situation. The advanced monitoring system they needed had been flagged for malfunction 2 months ago. The backup defibrillator was the same one that had been malfunctioning in the West Wing. The understaffing meant that every task took longer, every decision carried more weight, every crisis stretched already exhausted people even thinner. And then, as if the universe had decided to test everyone's limits, the CEO appeared. He shouldn't have been there at all. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday. But he had been in his office on the 4th floor, reviewing what he called cost-cutting measures for the next fiscal quarter. He had heard the commotion, and like a predator drawn to vulnerability, he made his way down to the emergency department. He arrived just as Michael Chin's body went rigid. The seizure hit like a lightning strike, sudden, violent, terrifying. His back arched off the bed, his jaw locked tight, his limbs convulsed in rhythmic spasms that made the bed rails shake. The monitors erupted in urgent alarms, red lights flashing, numbers spiking into dangerous territory. Carolyn and Dr. Anderson moved in perfect synchronization, following protocols, administering emergency medications, protecting his airway, trying everything in their training to break the seizure's grip. Nothing worked. The convulsions continued. His oxygen saturation began to drop. His lips turned pale, edging toward blue. Dr. Anderson tried a second round of medications. Still nothing. A third attempt. The seizure wouldn't break. Michael Chun was slipping away in front of them, and every second that passed narrowed his chances of survival. The CEO watched from the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, that familiar smirk settling onto his face. He saw the desperation in the medical team's movements, the fear beginning to creep into their efficiency. And he saw Carolyn Combs, still focused, still steady, still refusing to give up even as the situation deteriorated. That's when he saw his opportunity to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. And that's when he made the bet that would cost him everything. The alarms continued their relentless shrieking as the CEO's voice cut through the chaos with deliberate precision. "If you save him," he said, his eyes locked on Carolyn, "I'll resign." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena, except this wasn't about honor or fair combat. This was about power, humiliation, and reminding everyone in the room exactly who controlled their fates. His tone was casual, almost amused, as if he were placing a bet on a sporting event rather than a human life. There was no medical concern in his voice, no urgency, no recognition that a 30-year-old man was dying 3 feet away from him. There was only that smirk, that calculated cruelty that he had weaponized over 8 years of running Metropolitan General Hospital. He wanted witnesses. He wanted Carolyn to fail in front of her colleagues, to be broken publicly, to serve as a warning to anyone else who might forget their place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. The room's reaction was immediate and devastating. Dr. Bruce Anderson stood frozen, his stethoscope clutched in his hand, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to object but couldn't find the words. His eyes darted between the CEO and the seizing patient, caught between his medical oath and his very real fear of retaliation. He had seen what happened to people who challenged this man. He had bills to pay, a family to support, and in that terrible moment, his silence spoke louder than any protest could have. The security officer near the door shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving unconsciously to his radio, as if calling for backup could somehow resolve the ethical nightmare unfolding in front of him. He was supposed to maintain order, protect people, ensure safety. But what was he supposed to do when the danger came from the person at the top? His discomfort was visible in the tension of his shoulders, the way he looked anywhere except at the CEO's face. The two other nurses in the room, Jennifer and Marcus, had gone pale. They knew exactly what this was. They had been on the receiving end of the CEO's cruelty in smaller ways, and they recognized the script playing out before them. This was theater designed to destroy. Their fear wasn't just for Carolyn or even for the patient. It was the fear of working in a place where someone's life could become a prop in a power game, where human dignity meant nothing against administrative authority. But Carolyn Combs felt something different in that moment. Yes, there was anger, hot and sharp, at the casual cruelty, at the reduction of a human being to a bargaining chip, at the culture that allowed this man to turn life and death into entertainment. But beneath the anger was something stronger, determination. She had not spent 15 years saving lives to watch someone die, because a small man needed to feel powerful. She looked at Michael Chun. Not at the CEO, not at the watching staff, but at the man whose body was fighting a battle it was losing. His chest rose and fell in labored gasps. His hands twitched against the sheets. His life was slipping away, and she was the only person in the room still treating him like he mattered more than politics. Carolyn's hands remained steady as she reached for the bottle of water. Everyone expected her to fail, but they didn't know what she'd survived before coming here. Carolyn's assessment took less than 5 seconds, but in those seconds, her 15 years of emergency experience compressed into pure instinct. Michael Chin's jaw was locked in tonic rigidity, a dangerous complication that meant his airway was compromised and any attempt to force medication or intubation could cause aspiration. His oxygen saturation was dropping, the monitor showing 87% and falling. His brain was being starved of oxygen with every passing moment, and traditional interventions had already failed. She needed something different, something the textbooks didn't teach but experience had shown her. The bottle of water in her hand wasn't a random choice. It was calculated brilliance born from a case she had handled 7 years ago in Philadelphia, a teenage boy with status epilepticus whose lockjaw had made standard treatment impossible. She had discovered then that sometimes the body's most primitive reflexes could override even the most violent seizures. The swallowing reflex, when triggered carefully, could momentarily relax the jaw muscles and restore some control to the autonomic nervous system. She tilted Michael's head gently to the side, supporting his neck with one hand while uncapping the water bottle with the other. Timing was everything. The seizures came in waves. Violent convulsions followed by brief seconds of relative stillness before the next wave hit. She waited, counting the rhythm in her head, watching his body for the split-second window she needed. When the convulsion released its grip for just a moment, she brought the bottle to his lips and let a thin stream of water touch his mouth. Not enough to choke him, just enough to moisten his lips and trigger that ancient reflex buried deep in the brainstem. His throat moved slightly, a tiny swallow. His jaw relaxed fractionally, and she used that moment to adjust his airway positioning, tilting his head back just enough to let oxygen flow more freely into his lungs. She repeated the process, her voice low and steady as she spoke to him through the terror. "Michael, I'm right here. You're going to breathe. Just let your body breathe." Her tone wasn't loud or commanding. It was the kind of calm that cuts through panic, the voice of someone who absolutely believes in what they're doing. Between convulsions, she adjusted the oxygen flow, increasing it gradually as his airway opened, giving his starving brain the fuel it desperately needed. The medical reasoning was elegant in its simplicity. By triggering the swallowing reflex, She was accessing the vagus nerve, a major highway of communication between the brain and body. Stimulating it could help reset some of the misfiring electrical signals causing the seizure. Combined with proper airway management and optimized oxygen delivery, she was giving his brain a chance to find its own way back to normal rhythm. Dr. Anderson watched with growing comprehension, his medical training suddenly connecting dots he hadn't seen before. This wasn't just good nursing. This was the kind of innovative crisis management that couldn't be taught, only learned through years of refusing to give up on patients everyone else had written off. The CEO's smirk began to waver, his arms uncrossed. He shifted his weight, and something uncomfortable flickered across his face as he watched Carolyn's unwavering focus, her hands moving with practiced precision between each convulsion, her voice never losing that steady, reassuring quality. And then, after what felt like an eternity but was actually less than 3 minutes, Michael Chin drew a breath that was different from the others. It was deeper, clearer, more controlled. His convulsions began to soften, the violent rigidity giving way to smaller tremors. The oxygen monitor crept upward, 89, 91, 94. His chest rose and fell in a more natural rhythm. His jaw relaxed fully, and his eyes, which had been rolled back and unseeing, began to focus. The monitor stabilized, but something else was happening in that room, something no one expected. If you believe skill and compassion beat arrogance every time, hit subscribe. We're building a community that stands for what's right. Michael Chin's eyes opened slowly, like someone waking from a deep and troubled sleep. They were unfocused at first, confused, struggling to make sense of the bright lights and unfamiliar faces hovering above him. But they were open. He was alive. His chest continued to rise and fall in steady, natural breaths, and the monitors that had been screaming in alarm just minutes ago now hummed with the reassuring monotony of stable vital signs. The room fell into a stunned silence that felt almost sacred. It was the kind of quiet that follows miracles, when people who have just witnessed something extraordinary need a moment to process what they've seen. Dr. Anderson stood motionless, his stethoscope still clutched in his hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and something deeper, a rekindling of belief in medicine as it should be practiced, not as a political chess game, but as a genuine attempt to save lives against impossible odds. Jennifer and Marcus, the other nurses, had tears forming in their eyes. They had expected to watch a colleague fail, had braced themselves for tragedy, had prepared to witness the CEO's cruelty claim another victim. Instead, they had seen skill triumph over arrogance, compassion overcome cruelty, and one woman's refusal to give up change what seemed like an inevitable outcome. The CEO's smirk vanished completely. It didn't fade gradually. It simply disappeared, replaced by an expression that was harder to read. Surprise, certainly. Perhaps a flicker of grudging respect, but mostly something that looked uncomfortably like the realization that he had miscalculated badly. His arms hung at his sides now, his posture no longer commanding but uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. And then his phone began to vibrate. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he saw the incoming calls. All from numbers he recognized. All urgent. He stepped back slightly, his thumb hovering over the screen, clearly torn between answering and maintaining his presence in the room. But Carolyn wasn't paying attention to him anymore. Her entire focus had returned to Michael Chin, where it belonged. She lifted the water bottle again, this time offering him a small sip, just enough to wet his dry lips and soothe his throat. "You're okay," she said softly, her voice carrying that same steady reassurance that had guided him through the worst of the seizure. "You're safe. Just breathe. You're going to be fine." Michael's hand moved weakly across the sheet, searching for something to anchor himself to reality. Carolyn took his hand in hers, and his fingers closed around it with surprising strength for someone who had just fought death and won. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Gratitude, trust, the fundamental human need for connection in moments of vulnerability. His lips moved, trying to form words, but she shook her head gently. "Don't try to talk yet. Just rest. We've got you." Near the door, the security officer's radio crackled to life. He lifted it to his ear, listened for a moment, and his expression changed dramatically. Whatever message he was receiving, it wasn't routine. He glanced at the CEO, then at Carolyn, then back at his radio before stepping quickly into the hallway, his hand pressing the device closer to his ear to catch every word. The CEO's phone vibrated again and again. His jaw tightened as he finally answered one of the calls, stepping toward the corner of the room and speaking in a low, terse voice that couldn't quite hide his growing agitation. The CEO didn't know it yet, but his phone calls weren't about the patient. They were about him. Two people in dark suits appeared at the end of the hallway, their presence immediately commanding attention in the way that official investigators always do. They weren't rushing, but they moved with purpose, their credentials already visible on lanyards around their necks. Behind them, three members of the hospital's board of directors emerged from the elevator, their faces grim and their expensive suits slightly rumpled as if they had dressed in a hurry. It was nearly 1 a.m, and board members didn't show up at this hour unless something catastrophic was unfolding. The CEO ended his phone call abruptly, his confusion morphing into something sharper as he watched the group approach. His eyes darted from the investigators to the board members, his mind clearly working to understand what could possibly warrant this kind of attention at this time of night. He stepped into the hallway, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he used when reasserting control. "What's going on here? I wasn't informed of any." The lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many institutional cover-ups, cut him off with professional courtesy that barely concealed her distaste. "Mr. Harrison, we need to speak with you immediately. The board has requested your presence in the main conference room." "About what?" His voice had lost some of its commanding edge, replaced by a defensiveness that everyone present could hear. "About the formal complaint filed with the state medical board 3 days ago," she replied, holding up a tablet. "We've been conducting a preliminary investigation based on an anonymous tip that included rather extensive documentation." The CEO's face went pale. Anonymous tip? Documentation of what? The investigator's expression didn't change. "Systematic safety violations that have been ignored for over 2 years. Equipment malfunctions that were reported multiple times and deliberately suppressed. Patient complaints that were filed and subsequently disappeared from official records. Staff members who attempted to raise concerns and were silenced through intimidation, reassignment, or threats to their employment." She paused, letting the weight of each accusation settle. "The documentation is quite thorough. Dates, times, names, incident reports that were never filed with the proper authorities. Security footage showing patterns of behavior toward staff that constitute hostile work environment violations." One of the board members, an older man who had served on the board for 15 years, stepped forward. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "We've been reviewing the evidence for the past 6 hours. The tip included access to files we didn't even know existed. Internal communications, email threads, recorded conversations. Whoever sent this knew exactly where to look and what to document." The CEO's hands began to tremble slightly. "This is absurd. Someone is clearly trying to sabotage." "The security footage is time-stamped and unedited," the investigator interrupted. "We've already verified its authenticity. The patient complaints match medical records. The equipment failure reports that were never processed match maintenance logs that show systematic negligence." She looked at him with the kind of steady gaze that prosecutors use when they know they have an airtight case. "This isn't sabotage, Mr. Harrison. This is documentation of a pattern that has put patients at risk and created a culture of fear among your staff." The hallway seemed to shrink around him. His phone vibrated again, but this time he didn't even look at it. The CEO, who had stood at the foot of a dying patient's bed and made cruel wagers, was now facing something he couldn't smirk away, couldn't intimidate into silence, couldn't bury under administrative authority. In room 347, Carolyn continued to monitor Michael Chen's vitals, her back to the drama unfolding in the hallway, her attention completely focused on the patient whose life she had just saved. But who had sent the tip? And how did they have access to years of sealed records? Comment, karma, if you're loving where this is going. Justice is coming. The main conference room on the 4th floor had been transformed into an impromptu tribunal. The long mahogany table was covered with tablets, printed documents, and file folders that represented years of carefully hidden misconduct. The investigators sat on one side, their evidence organized with the precision of people who had built countless cases against institutional corruption. The board members occupied the other end, their faces reflecting a mixture of fury at being kept in the dark and embarrassment that this had happened under their governance. And at the head of the table sat the CEO, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the cornered defensiveness of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. The lead investigator opened a folder and began reading in a voice devoid of emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. Equipment failures dating back 26 months. A defibrillator that had been flagged as dangerous but remained in service because replacement wasn't cost-effective. Medication dispensary systems that failed safety audits but were never upgraded. Monitoring equipment that gave false readings, documented by staff but dismissed by administration. Each item was backed by maintenance logs, staff reports, and time-stamped photographs that left no room for interpretation. The CEO tried deflection first. These are operational decisions made in the context of significant budget constraints. Every hospital faces these challenges. We prioritize patient care within financial realities. His voice carried the rehearsed smoothness of someone who had talked his way out of accountability many times before. The investigator didn't look up from her documents. Patient care? We have 17 documented cases where patients experience complications directly linked to equipment failures you were explicitly warned about. 3 of those cases resulted in extended hospitalizations that could have been prevented. She slid a document across the table. This is the family of Margaret Whitmore, who suffered cardiac arrest when the backup defibrillator failed during a routine procedure. She survived, but her medical bills exceeded $200,000. The equipment failure had been reported 5 times. The CEO's jaw tightened. He tried denial next. I can't personally oversee every maintenance request. I have department heads responsible for. Your department heads sent you direct emails. Another investigator interrupted, pulling up messages on his tablet. Here's one from the head of nursing, dated 14 months ago, marked urgent, detailing safety concerns about the monitoring systems. Your response was, and I quote, address your staffing allocation issues before complaining about equipment. You didn't forward it to maintenance. You didn't investigate. You dismissed it. Then came the threats, the last refuge of failing authority. You need to be very careful about making accusations based on anonymous sources with obvious access to grind. My attorneys will be reviewing every aspect of this process, and if I find any procedural violations. The conference room door opened. Dr. Bruce Anderson entered, summoned by the board. His face was pale, but his shoulders were squared in a way they hadn't been in years. This was his moment, the moment he had been too afraid to seize for too long. The investigator gestured to an empty chair. Dr. Anderson, thank you for coming. We understand you've worked under Mr. Harrison's administration for 6 years. We'd like to hear about your experiences. Bruce sat down, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. I've watched good people leave this hospital because they couldn't work in this environment anymore. I've watched nurses file legitimate safety concerns and then get punished for it. I've personally reported equipment failures that endangered patients, and I was told to stop being dramatic. He looked directly at the CEO. 2 months ago, I almost quit. I was ready to walk away because I couldn't reconcile being a doctor. Someone who swears to do no harm, with working in a system where patient safety came second to budget lines and ego. The door opened again. Jennifer, the young nurse who had been humiliated during rounds, stepped in, followed by Marcus, who had been punished for reporting medication errors. Then Diane, reassigned to night shift for questioning staffing ratios. One by one, they came forward, emboldened by the presence of people who were finally willing to listen. Years of suppressed truth poured out in testimonies that were specific, detailed, and damning. Not exaggerations or emotional accusations, but concrete examples of a culture that had valued control over care, appearances over accountability, fear over fairness. The CEO watched his empire crumble in real time. Each testimony another crack in the foundation he had built on intimidation and institutional silence. His face had gone from pale to ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if physical contact with something solid could stop the collapse happening around him. And then the investigators asked the question everyone wanted answered. Who gave you this information? 72 hours earlier, Carolyn Combs had sat alone in the hospital's records room at 11:30 at night. She had legitimate access. Nurses often reviewed patient histories during night shifts when handling follow-up care, or preparing for complex cases. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the software of the computer as she navigated through digital files that should have been routine and unremarkable. But they weren't. She had started looking for a patient's previous admission records, a standard review for someone with recurring medical issues. What she found instead was a pattern that 15 years of emergency nursing had taught her to recognize immediately: the unmistakable signature of systematic cover-up. Incident reports that ended abruptly mid-sentence. Safety violations that were logged, then deleted, then replaced with sanitized versions that removed any mention of administrative responsibility. Equipment failure notifications that simply vanished from the system as if they had never existed. At first, she thought it might be a database error, some technical glitch that was eating records. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. Reports would exist in draft form with detailed descriptions of problems. Then the final versions would be stripped of anything that could implicate leadership. Timestamps showed the edits happening within hours of initial filing, always during administrative hours, always by users with high-level access codes. Carolyn's hands moved carefully across the keyboard, her nursing training merging with a methodical precision she had learned from years of documentation. She began taking screenshots, saving files to an encrypted drive she had brought from home. Every equipment failure report, every staff complaint that had been modified, every patient safety concern that had been minimized or erased. She cross-referenced maintenance logs with incident reports and found dozens of discrepancies. Official records claiming equipment was functional when maintenance logs showed it was flagged as dangerous. She worked through the night, her coffee growing cold beside her, her eyes burning from screen fatigue. She documented email chains between the CEO and department heads, showing a clear pattern of ignoring warnings, retaliating against staff who raised concerns, and prioritizing budget considerations over patient safety. She found evidence of nurses who had filed complaints and then mysteriously left the hospital within weeks, exit interviews that were never conducted, severance agreements with non-disclosure clauses buried in the fine print. By 4 a.m, she had assembled a case that was comprehensive, damning, and meticulously organized. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what it could cost her. Speaking up against powerful people rarely ended well for the person speaking. She had seen it happen throughout her career. Good people who raised legitimate concerns and found themselves marginalized, blacklisted, forced out of professions they loved. But she also knew what silence cost. She had watched that cost accumulate over 3 weeks at Metropolitan General Hospital. In the faces of nurses who had stopped hoping for change, in the resignation of doctors like Bruce Anderson who knew better but felt powerless, in the patients who were being put at risk every single day because one man valued control more than lives. So she made the choice that people with conscience always make when faced with institutional evil. She contacted the state medical board anonymously, uploaded every piece of documentation she had gathered, and provided a detailed analysis of patterns that investigators with proper authority could verify and expand upon. She knew the risks. She did it anyway. But Carolyn had learned something else. Something about the CEO that made her investigation personal. 5 years ago, Carolyn's younger sister Emma had walked into Riverside Medical Center in Cincinnati for what should have been a routine gallbladder removal. She was 34 years old, healthy, active, a middle school teacher who ran marathons on weekends. The procedure was laparoscopic, minimally invasive, something surgeons performed dozens of times every week with near-perfect success rates. Emma had joked with Carolyn the night before surgery, saying she'd be back to running within 2 weeks. But the equipment malfunctioned during the procedure. The laparoscopic camera system, a critical piece of technology that allowed surgeons to see inside the body, had been flagged for maintenance 3 weeks earlier. The flag had been dismissed as non-urgent by hospital administration. During Emma's surgery, the camera froze at a critical moment, causing a delay that led to complications. A small nick in the bile duct went unnoticed for precious minutes. By the time the surgical team realized what had happened and converted to open surgery, the damage was done. Emma survived, but the complications from that preventable error left her with chronic pain, digestive issues that would require lifelong management, and the end of her running career. The vibrant woman who had completed 5 marathons would struggle to walk up a flight of stairs without discomfort. She had to leave teaching because standing for long periods became unbearable. The hospital's initial response had been formulaic sympathy followed by aggressive legal maneuvering. Emma's complaints were met with technical explanations designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The incident report filed by the surgical team mysteriously disappeared from official records. The equipment maintenance logs were altered to show the camera system had passed inspection just days before her surgery. A lie that was discovered only months later during Emma's lawsuit discovery process. And the CEO who had overseen that culture of cover-up, who had prioritized equipment cost savings over patient safety, who had created an environment where maintenance warnings were routinely ignored. He faced no consequences. No termination, no license review, no public accountability. He was quietly reassigned to another hospital system, his reputation intact, his career uninterrupted, free to build the same toxic culture somewhere else. That CEO's name was Richard Harrison. And when Carolyn saw his name listed as the administrator of Metropolitan General Hospital while researching places to work near her aging mother, she recognized it immediately. The name had been seared into her memory through 2 years of watching her sister struggle, through depositions and legal battles, through the helpless rage of knowing that the person responsible had simply moved on to endanger other patients at other hospitals. Some people might call what Carolyn did next revenge. But revenge is about destruction for its own sake, about making someone suffer because you've suffered. That wasn't what drove Carolyn Combs. She didn't take the job at Metropolitan General to hurt Richard Harrison. She took it because she understood, in a way that only someone who has watched a loved one become collateral damage in institutional negligence can understand, that silence enables predators and accountability requires courage. She came to do her job with excellence, to care for patients with the skill and compassion she had always brought to nursing. But if, in the course of doing that job, she happened to notice patterns that indicated the same systemic failures that had harmed her sister were being replicated here, if she happened to document those failures with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what to look for, if she happened to ensure that this time, finally, someone would be held accountable before more families experienced what hers had, she didn't come for revenge. She came for accountability. If you believe in accountability over politics, smash that subscribe button. We're exposing the truth together. The conference room had gone silent after the investigators revealed their source. Richard Harrison sat motionless at the head of the table, his hands flat against the polished mahogany surface, as if trying to anchor himself to something solid, while everything he had built dissolved around him. The board members exchanged glances that communicated what words didn't need to. This was over. And there would be no negotiated exit, no quiet resignation with severance package and glowing references. This was accountability arriving 8 years late, but arriving nonetheless. The board chairman, a man named Robert Chun who had served in hospital administration for 30 years, cleared his throat and spoke with the formal precision of someone delivering a verdict. Mr. Harrison, effective immediately, your employment with Metropolitan General Hospital is terminated. The board will be releasing a public statement within the hour detailing the nature of the investigation, the findings that led to this decision, and our commitment to implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure patient safety and staff protection. He paused, letting the weight of institutional judgment settle. We will be cooperating fully with state investigators, and we will not be providing legal representation for any personal liability you may face. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies were credible, and the institution he had controlled through fear had finally found its voice. He reached down slowly and unclipped the ID badge from his belt, the same badge that had granted him access to every corner of this hospital, that had symbolized his authority, that staff members had learned to watch for so they could avoid him in hallways. He placed it on the conference table with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. It landed on the same table where he had held budget meetings that prioritized profit over people, where he had reviewed staff complaints and decided which ones to bury, where he had cultivated a culture that made fear more powerful than conscience. Now that badge sat there stripped of meaning, just a piece of plastic with a photo that would be deactivated before he reached the parking lot. The security officer who had witnessed the events in room 347 appeared at the door. His name was Thomas Wright, a 22-year veteran who had watched this hospital change under Harrison's leadership, who had seen good people leave and scared people stay, who had been ordered more than once to escort nurses off the premises for infractions that amounted to nothing more than speaking truth to power. Tonight, his role was different. "Mr. Harrison," he said quietly, professionally, "I'll need to escort you from the building." The walk through the hospital corridors was a reverse coronation. Word had spread with the speed that news always travels through institutions when power structures collapse. Staff members lined the hallways, not blocking the way, not saying anything, just bearing witness. Some had tears streaming down their faces, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. Some stood with arms crossed, their expressions reflecting relief mixed with the exhaustion of people who had survived something that should never have been endured. All of them were changed by what they were watching. The visible proof that speaking up could matter, that documentation could triumph over intimidation, that courage could be contagious. Jennifer stood near the nurse's station on the third floor, the young nurse who had been humiliated for stammering during rounds. She didn't smile or celebrate, but she stood a little straighter, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight of someone who expected to be crushed at any moment. Marcus was there too, the 7-year veteran who had been written up for reporting medication errors. He watched Harrison pass with an expression that wasn't vindictive but simply resolved. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration of what should have always existed. As they reached the main entrance, Thomas Wright held the door open. Harrison paused for just a moment, perhaps expecting some final word, some acknowledgement of his years of service. But Thomas simply maintained his professional demeanor, his face neutral, his duty clear. And then, as Harrison stepped through the doorway into the early morning darkness, Thomas turned back toward the hospital, and his eyes found Carolyn Combs, who was standing near the emergency department entrance. He gave her a slight nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention. Just the quiet recognition that passes between people who understand that doing the right thing often requires doing the hard thing, and that witnessing courage can awaken courage in others. It was a nod that said, "I saw what you did in that room. I saw what you did in the records room. I see you." And in that moment, Metropolitan General Hospital began the long process of becoming what it should have been all along. 2 weeks later, the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Metropolitan General Hospital with the kind of gentle warmth that makes recovery feel possible. Michael Chin stood in room 347, the same room where he had nearly died, though he remembered almost nothing of that night except fragments of fear and a calm voice telling him to breathe. Now he was dressed in his own clothes, a small duffel bag at his feet, discharge papers signed and tucked into his jacket pocket. His girlfriend stood beside him, her hand in his, her eyes still carrying the shadow of how close they had come to losing everything. He was healthy. The neurological tests had come back clear. The seizures were back under control with adjusted medication. His doctors had expressed cautious optimism that with proper management, he could return to his normal life. His job as a graphic designer, his weekend hiking trips, all the ordinary activities that seem unremarkable until you nearly lose the ability to do them. He was grateful in the way that people who have looked death in the face and been pulled back are grateful, with an intensity that changes how you see every mundane moment, every sunrise, every conversation with someone you love. But before he left, he had asked to see Carolyn Combs one more time. She arrived during her break, still in her scrubs, her hair pulled back in that same practical bun, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had 12 more hours of shift ahead of her. When she entered the room, Michael's face broke into a smile that carried genuine emotion. "I wanted to thank you before I left," he said, his voice steady now, so different from the desperate gasps she remembered from that night. "The doctors told me what you did. They said nobody else thought to try what you tried. They said you saved my life when everyone had basically given up." Carolyn shook her head gently, uncomfortable with the heroic framing. "I did what any good nurse would do. I refused to stop trying." "But that's exactly it," Michael's girlfriend interjected, her voice thick with emotion. "We've learned what was happening here. What had been happening for years. We know about the investigation, about the CEO, about all of it." She squeezed Michael's hand. "You didn't just save his life that night. You saved this place." Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, slightly worn as if he had carried it with him for days, revising and reconsidering what he wanted to say. "I wrote you something," he said, offering it to her. "You don't have to read it now, but I wanted you to have it. I'm not great with spoken words, but I can write down what I feel, and I needed you to know what that night meant. Not just to me, but to everyone who'll be treated here from now on. Carolyn took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. Not the physical weight, but the emotional significance of a stranger's gratitude, of a life continuing when it might have ended. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad you get to go home." They hugged, carefully, the way you embrace someone who is still healing. And then Michael and his girlfriend walked down the hallway toward the exit, toward the rest of their lives, toward second chances and future memories that almost didn't exist. Carolyn watched them go, then slipped the envelope into her pocket and returned to her rounds. It wasn't until late that night, after her shift had finally ended and she sat in her car in the parking lot with the engine running and exhaustion settling into her bones, that she opened the letter. Michael's handwriting was neat, artistic, the letters formed with care. She read by the dim overhead light, and his words carried the kind of raw honesty that comes from confronting mortality. He wrote about what he remembered from that night, not the medical details, but the feeling of terror, of his body betraying him, of consciousness slipping away like water through fingers. He wrote about the voice that had cut through the panic, steady and sure, telling him to breathe, telling him he was safe, anchoring him to life when everything else was chaos. He wrote about learning later what had happened, about understanding that his survival had been a catalyst for something larger, that his crisis had somehow exposed corruption that had endangered countless others. "I don't know if you believe in things happening for a reason," he wrote, "but I keep thinking about that night, about how the worst moment of my life became the moment that changed everything at that hospital, about how you could have just done what was expected, tried the standard interventions, declared it beyond saving, stepped back like everyone else. But you didn't. You saw me as someone worth fighting for even when fighting seemed pointless. And because you did, other people found their courage too. Doctors and nurses who had been silent started speaking up. Systems that were broken started getting fixed. A place that had been toxic started healing." He concluded with a line that Carolyn would think about often in the months that followed. "You gave me a second chance at life, but you gave this hospital a second chance too. Thank you for refusing to accept that things have to stay broken just because they've been broken for a long time." She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her eyes damp with tears she hadn't expected. On the passenger seat sat the water bottle from that night. She had kept it, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Perhaps it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools applied with skill and determination could achieve what complex interventions could not. Perhaps it was a symbol of refusing to give up even when circumstances seemed impossible. Perhaps it was just a plastic bottle that had happened to be in the right place at the right moment. But she kept it on her desk at the nurse's station, and sometimes during difficult shifts when exhaustion made her question whether any of this mattered, she would glance at it and remember a night when everything changed because one person chose courage over compliance, action over acceptance, and accountability over silence. Comment, "Thank you, Carolyn," if this story moved you. Let's celebrate the real heroes. 3 months after Richard Harrison's departure, Metropolitan General Hospital was beginning to remember what it felt like to function as a place of healing rather than a kingdom of fear. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Institutional culture doesn't change overnight, but the signs of renewal were unmistakable to anyone who had survived the previous regime. The new CEO was a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a physician with 30 years of emergency medicine experience who had built her reputation on the principle that patient safety and staff well-being were inseparable. Her first act had been to reinstate every safety protocol that had been quietly dismantled over the previous 8 years. Equipment maintenance requests were no longer filtered through cost-benefit analyses that prioritized budgets over lives. The defibrillator that had been malfunctioning for months was replaced within a week. Monitoring systems were upgraded. Staffing ratios were adjusted to meet national safety standards rather than profit margins. But more than the equipment changes, something less tangible was shifting in the hallways and break rooms of Metropolitan General. Staff members made eye contact again. Nurses didn't lower their voices when discussing patient care concerns. Doctors didn't swallow their questions during rounds. The culture of fear that had permeated every interaction for years was slowly being replaced by something radical. Trust that speaking up wouldn't result in retaliation, that safety concerns would be heard and addressed, that competence and compassion mattered more than political maneuvering. Dr. Bruce Anderson had been appointed to head the newly established Patient Safety Committee, a role that channeled his medical expertise and his hard-earned understanding of what happens when systems fail. He approached the position with the fervor of someone making amends, someone determined to ensure that the silence he had maintained for too long would never be required of anyone again. His first committee meeting had drawn 23 staff members, all eager to contribute to building something better from the ruins of what had been. Carolyn Combs still worked the night shifts. She had been offered promotions, administrative roles, opportunities to leverage her newfound recognition into career advancement. She had politely declined them all. Her calling had never been management or visibility. It was the work itself, the patient care, the crisis interventions, the quiet competence that made a difference when it mattered most. She remained exactly who she had always been. Excellent without being flashy, principled without being self-righteous, present in the moments when presence meant everything. On a Tuesday evening, as Carolyn prepared for another night shift, she noticed a young woman standing near the nurse's station with that unmistakable first-day nervousness, checking her badge repeatedly, reviewing papers she had probably already memorized, trying to project confidence while clearly feeling overwhelmed. Her name tag read, Sarah Mitchell, RN, and she couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Carolyn approached with a cup of coffee in hand and a gentle smile. "First day?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah nodded, exhaling nervously. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who remember their own first days," Carolyn replied, offering her the coffee. "You'll do great. The team here is solid, and we support each other. That's what good nursing is. Not being perfect, but being willing to learn and having people around you who'll help you grow." Sarah took the coffee gratefully, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I've heard stories about this place, about how things used to be and how they changed. About," she hesitated, then continued, "about you, about what you did." Carolyn shook her head gently. "I just did my job, but I'll tell you something important." She met Sarah's eyes with that same steady gaze that had guided a dying patient back to life. "If you ever see something wrong, equipment that's not working right, a protocol that doesn't make sense, a situation that puts patients at risk, speak up. Document it. Don't stay silent because you're new or because you think someone else will handle it. This place listens now. That matters." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was receiving more than orientation advice. She was being welcomed into a culture that had been fought for, that had been purchased with courage and carried forward by people who refused to let fear win. Carolyn squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture of solidarity and welcome, then moved toward the emergency department to begin her shift. Just another night, just another nurse doing her job with steady hands and unshakable principles. Because one nurse with steady hands and unshakable principles proved that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it changes everything. The stories we tell ourselves about heroism often involve grand gestures, dramatic confrontations, sweeping declarations, moments of obvious bravery that announce themselves with fanfare and certainty. We imagine heroes as people who are fundamentally different from us, who possess some special quality that allows them to act when others freeze, to speak when others stay silent, to stand when others bow. But the truth about courage is quieter and more accessible than we usually admit. It lives in the decision a nurse makes at 11:30 at night when she's exhausted from a double shift, but notices something wrong in patient records and chooses to investigate rather than ignore. It lives in the moment a doctor decides that his mortgage and his fear matter less than the oath he took to protect patients. It lives in the choice that staff members make to come forward with testimony, even when they know it might cost them professionally, personally, permanently. Carolyn Combs still works at Metropolitan General Hospital. She arrives for her shifts with the same quiet professionalism she brought on her first day, and she leaves 12 hours later having made a difference in ways both measurable and invisible. She hasn't written a book about her experience. She hasn't given interviews or sought recognition. When people ask her about that night, and they do, occasionally, in whispered conversations during breaks, she redirects the attention to the patient who survived, to the staff members who found their voices, to the systemic changes that now protect people she'll never meet. Michael Chun, the 30-year-old patient whose crisis became a catalyst, made a full recovery. His seizures remain controlled through careful medication management and regular neurological monitoring. He returned to his work as a graphic designer, to his weekend hikes, to the ordinary rhythms of a life that continues because someone refused to accept that continuation was impossible. He thinks about that night sometimes, not with trauma, though the memory carries weight, but with a kind of profound gratitude that has reshaped how he moves through the world. He volunteers now at a patient advocacy organization, helping families navigate hospital systems, ensuring that people understand they have the right to ask questions, to demand safety, to expect that institutions serve patients rather than protect administrators. Richard Harrison, the former CEO, faces ongoing investigations by the state medical board. The scope of the inquiry has expanded beyond Metropolitan General to include his tenure at previous hospitals, including Riverside Medical Center in Cincinnati, where Emma Combs was harmed 5 years ago. 17 staff members have come forward with testimonies that detail patterns of negligence, retaliation, and systemic suppression of safety concerns. The legal proceedings will take years. Justice in institutional contexts always does. But the wheels are turning with the inevitability of documented evidence and collective testimony. Those 17 staff members represent something larger than individual grievances. They represent the breaking of silence that happens when one person's courage creates permission for others to find their own. Jennifer, the young nurse who was humiliated for stammering, testified about a culture where staff were punished for being human. Marcus detailed medication errors that were buried rather than addressed. Diane spoke about staffing ratios that endangered patients but enriched profit margins. Dr. Anderson provided medical expert testimony about the gap between what was required for patient safety and what was actually provided. Each testimony was specific, documented, devastating in its accumulation. The broader transformation at Metropolitan General continues unevenly, as all real change does. There are still difficult days, still budget constraints, still the ordinary challenges that every hospital faces. But the fundamental culture has shifted in a way that everyone who works there can feel. Safety concerns are addressed rather than dismissed. Staff turnover has decreased by 40% in 3 months. Patient satisfaction scores are climbing. Nurses report feeling supported rather than surveilled. Doctors describe being able to practice medicine according to their training rather than administrative convenience. These outcomes matter because they represent lives that will be saved not through dramatic interventions, but through systems that function as they should, equipment that works, staff who are empowered to speak up, leadership that prioritizes care over optics. Every patient who receives treatment at Metropolitan General from this point forward benefits from what Carolyn Combs did in that records room at 11:30 at night, when she could have simply finished her shift and gone home. Sometimes the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. A bottle of water applied with skill and steady hands saves one life and exposes a system that was endangering hundreds. A decision to document rather than ignore becomes the foundation for institutional accountability. A nurse who chooses to speak truth to power, not loudly, not dramatically, but thoroughly and undeniably, creates ripples that become waves that eventually reshape the shore. This story is true in the way that matters most, not necessarily in its specific details, but in its essential truth about how change happens in places where power has calcified into cruelty. It happens because someone decides that silence is too expensive, that complicity is unbearable, that the risk of speaking up is smaller than the cost of staying quiet. It happens because competence meets conscience and refuses to separate them. It happens because one person's choice to act creates permission for others to do the same. If this story reminded you why we fight for what's right, subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us tell more stories of courage and justice. Stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things not because they're special, but because they refuse to accept that wrong must remain wrong simply because it's always been that way. And if you've ever stood up when it was hard, if you've ever spoken truth when silence would have been easier, if you've ever chosen accountability over convenience, comment, "I did my part." You're not alone. Your courage matters. Your voice creates echoes that reach further than you know. Because somewhere right now, someone is facing their own moment of choice, to document or ignore, to speak or stay silent, to act or accept. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it changes everything.